of the medieval period. It's also true of Ibn Wahab. I didn't have time to go into that. But Ibn Wahab is also heavily cited in that work. But only one of the 23 surviving primary sources from Ibn Wahab's writing is cited. 22 of the 23 sources he leaves behind are ignored. And that one source is an anti-Shia treatise written as he was being invaded, that the Najd was being invaded by Persian forces. Thirdly, finally, the Islamic State is anti-tribal, and that is no surprise. Revolutionary successionist movements around the world have been anti-tribal. They have not, but they have been reinventing. They wish to reinvent an ideology. If that's Marxism, if that's nationalism, whatever, they reinvent that as a mobilizing discourse, gather up support. So IS is no different, and we shouldn't be surprised with that. They're particularly hostile to the Saudi clerical tradition, so they cannot be regarded as Wahhabi, even if we accept that pejorative term, which most Muslims reject. And it cannot be regarded as Salafi. The great Salafi scholars, in the mainstream, Salman Auda, loads, have all moved heavily away, rejected completely the Islamic State, and even those that might be called Salafi jihadi by counter-terrorism, spooks and writers, those are also condemned, systematically and vigorously condemned by Islamic State. They don't want to be part of Maqdisi or any of those people. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim and Neil. It's really thought-provoking way of starting our conference. And we have now time, ladies and gentlemen, for around half an hour for your questions. And as you know, at conferences, probably this is the most interesting part. The opportunity of having a Q&A and having the opportunity of leading scholars with us. I think it's a great opportunity to be able to ask questions. And what I will do is I will take questions perhaps in 2 to 3, and I will ask you to introduce yourself. I would appreciate if there are questions rather than long commentaries, but obviously if you want to express a particular view and opinion, feel free. But I think questions would actually lead the conversation here. And while you are thinking your first questions, I want to use my executive power here and ask the first question in a way. I think as far as the Eurasian politics and society, the theme of the conference is concerned, both of you approach that from different angles, but it was really complementary. So you unpack various issues of identity, culture, religion, civilization, and then I think they really matter whatever the issue is in Eurasian context, whether it's the political economy, it's the mainstream politics, the migration, it's the conflict resolution. Those issues really matter. And I think it seems to me that both of you, excuse me, both of you, using this terminology of developing a narrative in a way that, whether it's the civilization theory, the way that the narrative is structured about the other civilizations, and what that means in a way. And in a way, those civilizations have their own narratives about themselves and the rest. You know. So there is a kind of a juxtaposition of narratives around civilization theory. And similarly, I think what Tim shared with us around Islamic State, and within that, the narratives about the Islamic State, whether it's the media or in policy circles, but then it's really interesting the way the Islamic State has built its own narrative about itself and what is the source of information. So, with that note, my question is really how that narrative development might be changing in the contemporary era, in sort of like the Trump era, the kind of the fake news era. How much of this narrative that you presented would be used in the contemporary context of it, and what kind of narratives that we are likely to hear in years than in order to explain the politics and the international affairs in Eurasia. So that's really my first question, and let's start with that. I don't know who would like to take first.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. Yeah, narratives, I mean, and others. I think that's a good question. I mean, I would really recommend Mahmoud Mamdani's book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, if you, on the topic of narratives and how certain, what he says is that in the war on terror, the West needed to create a narrative of good Muslims versus bad Muslims. It needed to find allies to help fight its opponents. And I think that fits very well with the portrayal of the association between Islamic State and Salafism. Salafism has been promoted as this kind of, as this bugbear, as this new kind of communist living under all our beds. And I think sadly, the Muslim world has bought very heavily into that. I was doing some interviews with the Ba'is, the mosque preachers in Bursa last year, and they talked a lot about the dangers of Salafism. And I thought, well, why is Salafism dangerous? I mean, Salafism as an idea, as a kind of living the life of the pious ancestors, which all Muslims kind of connect to Islam through, isn't intrinsically dangerous. It's never been dangerous before. It's just been dangerous now. And it's interesting how words become habituated and take on new meanings. And at least with the word Wahhabi, it's kind of laughably, Orientalist, right? No Muslim calls themselves Wahhabi. Whereas Salafism is more complex. It's a term that Muslims connect with. And I think that's quite interesting to reflect on, the power of these kind of terms and their role in the geopolitics of warfare and the war on terror. And just on the Starbuck there, I think the key problem with understanding Islamic State is that their publications are all prohibited. I mean, we're being infantilized by the British government and other governments who have banned Darwin. Why shouldn't we read Darwin? They're so terrified that in reading these kind of gory, horrible magazines talking a lot of rubbish about Islam, that we're going to all then go out and put a bomb in Ariana Grande concert or something. This is ridiculous. We should be allowed to find out for ourselves what Islamic State says about itself and make our own judgment. Isn't that the very bedrock of a liberal democracy? And I find it very undemocratic to pick up Al's first initial point in his introduction about democratization of knowledge, but actually that all these magazines should be prohibited. This law was only passed 5 or 6 years ago. It's a new restriction on our civil liberty, but it's been passed without comment because we're so afraid of the Salafis living in our neighbourhood streets. It seems to be a kind of McCarthyite reinvention of the communists.
Thanks. I'm tempted to, at this stage, get into a conversation about the meaning of reality and whether narrative is reality in its own way. To my mind, I think I'm reasonably confident that there is a material reality out there. I'm reasonably confident that my perceptions are reliable when I see a group of people in this room, when I see the room. I had a microphone in my hand, I got that. Now, turning to narrative, I suppose in a way narrative is real as soon as you write it down, in some sense, whether or not it accurately depicts materiality. The more influential a narrative gets, the more real it gets in general terms. That's to say, if people behave on the basis of a narrative, they can create facts on the ground. In a way, I'm sorry to, going back to Huntington, to my mind, I don't think, as a guest, I don't think that the book is reasonably useful as a depiction of existing or coming problems in world politics. I think it's better to see it as a narrative. It's a narrative that justifies certain things. It's a narrative that justified the first war in Iraq, and arguably that justifies the second narrative in Iraq. It's a narrative that justifies the continuing growth of the military power of Western states in a context where the major military threat to them just disappeared. The disappearance of a major threat is always inconvenient to national security bureaucracies. So they find another one. So, power politics today, civilizations tomorrow. In other words, they rewrite the narrative. And by the way, I mean, I don't mean to dwell too much on the United States. If you think about, speaking of Eurasia, the increasing interest in Russia, which has been around for a while, but the increasing interest in Eurasia and Eurasian identity and Russia as a Eurasian civilization. Well, frankly, I don't know what a Eurasian civilization means anyway, but I can see the political value for the Russian elite. It basically justifies a regional diplomacy of hegemony, and it justifies, it's the intellectual underpinning for their efforts to build deep relations with China and India. And, by the way, Iran, we shouldn't forget Iran. So I think the real problem with narrative inventions of identity, and by the way, nationalism is a narrative invention of identity as well. The real problem with them is, so long as they have no political impact, they're sort of eccentricities. If people who deploy these narratives get people to believe these narratives, then societies act on those narratives. Sometimes that can be a really good thing. Sometimes it can be a disaster.
Thank you. Right. Okay, now I can turn to you for your question. Can I see just hand to the questions? I know drop how many questions here. So we have 3 questions to start. Let's start from here. Do you have a microphone? Do you have a microphone? If you could introduce yourself first.
Hello, of course. My name is Tahanes. I'm an undergraduate student from Istanbul University, sociology major. My question is to Mr. Macfarlane. Now, when you're saying that when you act upon a narrative, it becomes reality, more or less. Tom's theorem, I think, social reality becomes real in its conclusion, basically. So given that then sometimes in some spaces, civilizational discourse is on the rise. And like, let's say towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, we see that as a very significant, there is like a worldview crisis among the Ottoman elite, yeah? And maybe we can say that foreign policy is significantly shaped by that discourse when compared to other states, or at least in this time period. You more or less already answered my question, but my question would be, maybe from an indirect approach, within countries where civilizational discourse is more prevalent, how would this impact its internal dynamics and possibly due to political leaders trying to sway the public behind them, would be shaping their foreign policy upon civilizational discourse that has become popular and prevalent among society? Since I'm not very familiar with it, I'd also like to ask whether how much prevalent this is, especially in Russia or in other Eurasian countries, and how much you think that this is significant in today's nation states.
Great, thank you very much. Let's take the second question over there. The gentleman, the glasses on the right-hand side. Start there after.
My question is to Professor Jacoby. My name is Ali Granway. I am retired academic from London. I start from a different point. In 2011, when the Arab Spring appeared, the Iranian clerics said it is not Arab Spring, it is Islamic awakening. But I said minority state cannot make an interpretation of what was happening in the Arab world precisely. When in 2014, Islamic State appeared, I said probably this one is Islamic awakening. The Arab uprising, the Arab Spring began in 2011 in Syria, and uprising of people or changes or civil war in Syria didn't start in 2014 by Islamic State, but actually by Arab Spring. I wonder, you who made good research on Islamic State, have ever noticed in Islamic State literature, what was their idea about Arab Spring? Did they recognize the Arab Spring when they occupied Raqqa in Syria or Mosul in Iraq? And they condemned it, or they appreciated it, or whether they said their movement was a parallel movement or some a different alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a really interesting question. Now let's take one more question. The gentleman on the right hand side.
Hello, Osama Mohammed from Bachir University, studying international relations. I had some points on the speech you made, Mr. Jacoby, in the ending. You said that we should not consider ISIS as Salafis nor as Wahhabis, but considering the resources that they use for justifying their acts, they have the same sources, for example. They both exclude the scholars, as you mentioned before, and they also believe in the same scholars that ISIS believes, like Salafis also perhaps in the same time. And there's something we call the Salafis, like in the main intellectualism, we call them the Salafis with no arms, like the Salafis that are not in power, because they believe in the same thing, but they don't have enough power to do it. And also in one of your comments you just made after the speech, you said that Salafism is an idea and we should not be very scared of it, or it's not as dangerous as it seems. I believe that Salafism is not an idea or an intellect, because every idea and intellect is based on questioning. But in Salafism there's something called naql in Arabic, which means direct transfer. They don't believe in using their mind to question everything that they read in Quran or Hadith. Thank you very much.
Great. So let's start with Neil. Got one question, and then I think I'm answer the question.
Thank you for your question. This is a question about impact of narrative, both within societies and on their foreign policies, or their place in the world. I'm reminded here, by the way, speaking of narrative, not to be parochial. You think about the President says the United Kingdom is a boring place. It has not been terribly boring in the past year, where we had a decision by referendum to leave the European Union, and subsequently an absolutely unanticipated early election leading to a disaster for the government in question, which means that they don't have a majority in Parliament. So at a time when we need, what is the phrase? Strong and stable leadership to carry through the Brexit negotiations, we don't have it. So but what's the point here? This is about competing narratives in part. On the one hand, there's a British, and this is not a comment on my Scottish ethnic ancestry. This is an English narrative, not a British narrative. The narrative that the European Union and its values and its institutions are undermining British sovereignty, and we are different. We have always been different, and we will always be different. And by the way, ours is an Anglo-Saxon civilization. So, it's all narrative. So, the obvious way to move forward is to leave the EU and make Britain great again in a broad, global, Anglo-Saxon community. What's going on there? Well, the problem with narratives is I'm very good at seeing the instrumental value of narrative, both domestically and in foreign policy. The real problem for me is that some people really do believe this stuff, and you can't really tell who believes it and who's just using it instrumentally. Theresa May, interestingly, supported remaining in the EU before she was Prime Minister. Then they got the referendum, so now she believes in rebuilding what? The English and the British Empire? I have no idea. Now, on the other hand, this rhetoric, which was initially not heard, it was very useful in securing support in the electorate during the process of referendum. Whether people believe it or not probably depends on who they are. One problem also with ascertaining this in the contemporary world is that many politically significant figures, this is going to sound terrible, are simply not as well educated as they have been at some point in the past. So someone like, what's his name? The guy who drinks beer, Nigel Farage. This was the leader of the UK Independence Party. I'm not sure he has any beliefs at all. He just likes to cause trouble. You know, it's fun. Let's see what we can bring today. And, you know, Nigel Farage is, he is historically relevant, but now politically irrelevant. His time has passed. But I can think of another few people who are politically ill-informed, undereducated, and who simply like to break things. For example, the current President of the United States. I mean, does Mr. Trump, speaking of narratives, does he actually have a narrative of foreign policy? I don't think he's thought about it. So, in any event, what effect can these have? I think that the narrative about terrorism, and which for many British people is reimagined as a civilizational threat emanating from the Middle East and associated with immigration. That is basically what they have been encouraged to believe by some political forces in Great Britain. So what effect does that have internally? I would refer to Kim's comments about reading, the intelligence services hassling you if you read a magazine, or if you have the wrong Facebook friends. My first experience of I don't use Facebook, I'm too old for that. My first experience was in the beginning of the second phase of the Chechen War, which would have been 1999 through 2002. The Chechen resistance got educated about the web. So they had a website. And I used to being naive, I used to just click on the website and happily read away. They have Russian translations as well as Arabic translations. And, but this is really interesting. And I got a knock on the door one day in college, in Oxford, from some guy. He said, "Hi, I'm from MI5. I said, "Oh, that's nice. What can I do for you?" They said, we would like you to explain your web browsing habits. And now, of course, you can go to jail for this kind of thing. That's an internal effective narrative, to my mind. I guess I'll leave it there. I probably stumbled along far enough.
And Neil, when I said that the life in the UK is kind of dull, it was really in comparison to probably my original country, Turkey. That in comparison to Turkey, I think most places on earth would be really dull because the rhythm of things that change here and what happened over the last few years. And post-Brexit and the kind of national elections, Theresa May, Farage, I mean, they really they don't have that much of substance in comparison to what happens here in Turkey. So it's already, I guess, not
Thanks. Two great questions, I think, requiring new papers, a new 30-minute presentation on each, I think. I mean, you're absolutely right that Islamic State didn't arrive in 2014. It didn't appear from the sky, like from heaven. Islamic State appeared from the 2003 invasion. I mean, according to Jordanian intelligence, Zarqawi went into Iraq through Iran. Iran sent Zarqawi to Iraq. He was having medical treatment there. He was facilitated, his transport was facilitated by the Qataris, seeking to undermine the occupation, the coalition's military presence. And he developed his arguments and his initially quite small organizations in Anbar province during 2003, 4, 5. And with some success. By 2006, he was one of the leading, his organization was one of the leading separatist movements within the kind of spectrum of insurgency there. And of course, he benefited greatly from 2011. The Arab Spring also occurred in Iraq. In 2011, there was massive demonstrations throughout the country. Diyala province announced that it planned to secede from the rest of Iraq. And that's great for Zarqawi. By then dead, of course, but the Islamic State in Iraq profited a great deal from that popular uprising. And from that basis emerged. And of course, 2014 is only, my arbitrary starting point because that's when Darbouk appeared, that's all. Islamic State was executing large numbers of Arabs in the region for many years and ignored by the West. It was only when they started to behead white people on high-definition TV that the press in the West took any interest at all. Arab lives are of no consequence in the news media of the West, by and large. But when they executed Alan Henning and other Western hostages, then they became the devil incarnate. We took an interest. IS condemns the Arab Spring in Darbouk. It's absolutely scathing about Morsi, about Ghannouchi, about all those kind of Ahnada people, about all the kind of democratic Tahrir Square. It's all condemned in Darbouk. But in reality, of course, Islamic State works with people on the ground. So it's willing to work with Adnan Dalemi, with Ali Hatim, whoever it finds on the ground in Anbar province, in particular, where it really, its heartland was. And as it went up the Euphrates River from Fallujah, going upstream into Syria, it continued to work with local tribespeople who had been themselves involved in some way in the anti-Assad or anti-Maliki uprisings. So there's a disjuncture between what it says as a narrative, a discourse, which was my primary focus, and how it governs on the ground. Inevitably, isn't that true of all politics? There's a disjuncture between what Theresa May says about herself and about how she governs Britain, clearly. Okay, second question, Salafis. So the first responsibility of any academic or anyone really is to be clear on terms, clarity of terms. So what does Salafi really mean? So when you use the word Salafi, do you know who you're really talking about? Because in my paper I listed names, and that's what I think we have to do. Be specific about who are Salafis and who are not Salafis. Because after all Muslims are Salafi. They are all interested in the Tabaeen and in the Sahaba. That's how all Muslims seeking to connect with Islam through the example of ancestors. That's all Salaf means, right? Ancestor. So we need to be specific about who you mean. If you are talking about those who advocate violence, well, that's fine. We can talk about those. Let's look at Abu Muhammad al-Disi or something, who has written about the use of violence in advancing social change in the Middle East. Let's look at that content and be specific about who we mean. I'm not pretending there is nobody who is a threat or nobody who is not willing to use violence. Of course there are people willing to use violence. I'm from Manchester. We just finished burying 20 children, in an Ariana Grande concert, right? I'm well aware that, there are Muslims out there willing to use violence. But my point is, arbitrarily calling them Salafi or Wahhabi, this has a meaning. We have to be much more intelligent about, how we categorize people. Because after all, otherwise, we're just falling into the trap of the terrorologists, the counter-terrorism literature, who don't have any training in Islamic studies, by and large. They don't really know who they mean either. And we're just following their terminology blindly, accepting that Salafis, there's something wrong with Salafi. Believing, for example, that Ibn Taymiyyah is a Salafi. It's written throughout the terminology literature. He's a Qadiri Sufi. These are Sufis, writing in a Sufi tradition. And there's a fabulous report from Rand in which it says American policy needs to connect with Sufism in order to isolate Salafism. I mean, that's the level of discourse that we're at. I mean, as though Sufis were blameless. They forget about the Sunusi. They forget about the fact that bin Laden was a Sufi. He wore a pinky ring on his finger. He read Fatiha for the dead at 9/11. He came from a Sufi Yemeni family. This is ludicrous. The level of knowledge in separating Sufi from Salafi, ridiculous. And this is precisely what Mamdani is talking about when he says this is an arbitrary selection of allies. It's trying to recreate Muslims as good and bad in order to execute military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq, and to recruit ideological friends and isolate ideological enemies. But all this is imagined. This is imagined by the West. The Muslim world doesn't fall into these categories. And you can't recreate Taymiyyah as a Salafi. This is rewriting history to a ludicrous degree. So, just that final point you raised about textual reading. Of course, the Athari tradition that Taymiyyah put forward involved quite a textual reading of the Quran based on Imam Ahmed's more textual understanding. But if you read Taymiyyah closely, this is what most real scholars of Taymiyyah said. Taymiyyah is interested predominantly in returning to text as a way of reducing the power of the Mamluk corrupt fuqaha, the scholars and the lawyers, who he saw as completely corrupt. And he blamed them for the success of the Mongols and the Crusades. So he said, well, let's return to the Quran and the Sunnah closely, and the example of the Salaf, as a way of restating our connection to Islam, and particularly restating state power. So here, if you read him closely, he's a very conservative, statist voice. He's not writing for people like Zahawi, who want to turn the world upside down and rebel against Baghdad and overthrow things. He's writing in a very statist tradition in which we need order. And he says repeatedly that the bedrock of civilization is order. We need to have proper rules, proper regulations, and social order. And this is how we will keep the Mongols out, he said, of Damascus. I mean, he was wrong. I mean, they took Damascus anyway. But the point is that there is nothing in Taimyr that you can connect the kind of beheading hostages. This is insane. Emissaries are specifically protected in the Fed. You cannot execute an emissary. You know, Alan Henning went there to protect and to save Syrian people, to give them food, to give them water, etc. And they cut his head off. You can't find any legitimization of that in Taimyr, or I would suggest even in Maqdisi.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so your hand, and is there anybody else who would like to ask a question? Okay, let's take those two questions. I know we are a bit past time, but why not? They're all here. So, shall we get the microphone to...
Thank you. Sophia Abdurrahimova, PhD, Harvard University, United States. I have two short questions, and both of them are to Professor Macfarlane. And would you define Eurasia as a civilizational construct? If yes, how would you define it? And Eurasia as a civilizational construct? And if yes, how would you define it? If no, why? And the second question is kind of methodological question. I am not IORist. That's why I'm curious about this question. So you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh as a most likely case for testing Huntington's hypothesis. So don't you think that on the analytical level, we should distinguish two things, whether civilizational difference causes a conflict or civilizational diversity is the reason of a certain outcome in a conflict? So again, if you like, you can use Nagorno-Karabakh example. So you mentioned that the problem is the land ownership, which is correct. But I think in the outcome or the state of the conflict right now is most probably comes most probably from the diversity of the civilization. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. Just one more question there on the left-hand side. Salter up there.
My name is Shalar. I'm a PhD candidate at Abuja University, Department of International Politics, and I would like to ask the team about your conclusion. You said the Salafi and Wahhabis actors or scholars condemned by the ISIS, Islamic State. And when you replied the question, you mentioned about the US invasion. When we look at the born of the Islamic State in Iraq, and we can see the connection between the Ba'ath party and the Islamic State, because you know the Islamic State officers, some of the officers came from the Saddam's army, and especially Islamic State benefited the reactions or the protests against the US invasion, and I think we can see the connection between the Ba'ath party and the Islamic State in the first years of the ISIS. Do you think that does this become a reason of your conclusion, especially why the Salafi or Wahhabist actors condemned by the ISIS? Do you think what is the role of this connection between Ba'ath and ISIS? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. There's two questions.
Thank you. Is Eurasia a civilization construct? I see Eurasia as predominantly a geographical concept, i.e. it is a physical space. That too, by the way, is quite problematic because people can't quite figure out where it ends. It's sort of like Europe. You know, where's the end of Europe? Is it Vladivostok or is it Berlin? But I think it is geographical. I think in the Soviet Union, because the concept of Eurasianism arose well before the collapse of the USSR. And subsequently, I think there has been a geopolitical reason to construct an idea of Eurasia, not least in the old days. I mean, it was convenient to the Soviet leadership to say, hey, you know, we're not Europeans, we're Asians. We are the bridge between, we're Eurasians, we are the bridge between Europe and Asia, and therefore you should feel friendly towards us, effectively, to a greater extent than you feel friendly to the capitalist imperialists, if you will. So, yeah, I mean, in a sense, as a continental combination of Europe and Asia, it is a physical thing. It's a supercontinent. It's in part manipulated for geopolitical reasons. The idea is used instrumentally to further the foreign and security policy interests of the states who are promoting it. The question then, where did civilization go? The question there would be, who wishes to encourage and then infuse a civilizational identity into which societies? I think we're not far enough down the track to be able to answer that question. I mean, if you ask, I don't know, somebody in Tromsø in Norway, and you ask somebody in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia whether they share a Eurasian identity, I doubt that this is not sort of percolated downwards into the large public consciousness of identity. On most likely cases, just to clarify, I said Caucasus was the most likely case for the theory. Nagorno-Karabakh is a derivative of my use of Nagorno-Karabakh as an example of the failure of civilizational theory to actually helpfully apply, to helpfully explain, I should say, conflict. I think if you want my brief exposition of the causes of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I think in a profound sense you have ethno-national diversity between the two sides. You have a long history of periods of very poor relations, but some periods of quite good relations between them. That leads you to say, okay, fine, well, how did we get from a period of reasonably good to reasonably bad relations? And that gets you to proximate causes, and I think the collapse of the Soviet Union had a huge impact. I'm aware that the conflict began in February 1988, before that collapse, but it was already going. And the most significant element of the pre-collapse period to me was that as the Soviet center in Moscow weakened, national authorities had more space to effectively take their countries. And if you're going to do that, if you're shifting from a sort of vague ideological construct about class ideology and building socialism and the universality of the works of Marx and Engels and, of course, Lenin, if you're moving from that, it just collapses. You need a new one. You go shopping, and you get ethno-national conflict. And the final element of that is just the huge uncertainty faced by people, normal people, throughout the Soviet Union. The system was not working for them. People were going hungry. The factories were closing. There was rampant inflation, even in ruble times. And people were suffering. So people who are suffering are looking for answers to their problems, and what one function of the elites is to deliver those answers. And in the Caucasus context, and by the way, Georgia, exactly the same thing because he has also put the end of his route. Azerbaijan was a bit farther behind on this political metric because the leadership wasn't sure about the collapse of about the dismemberment or collapse of the USSR, and wasn't entirely confident about its capacity to subsist and survive as an independent state. But all of these doubts and so on, they all got wrapped up in Karabakh anyway. It really didn't matter whether they doubted it or not. So the other part of that question was, did civilizational diversity affect the outcome or determine the outcome of the conflict? I guess you probably have noticed that I'm not terribly enthusiastic about explaining specific events in civilization terms anyway. Okay, I'm sorry. In this instance, why effectively did Armenia and Karabakh win? That's the outcome of the war. And they did so partly because of the disorganization of the Azerbaijani forces and the Azerbaijani state. And they did so also because they were receiving financial infusions and also infusions of weapons from a nearby great power and also a nearby regional power. Since we're in a room full of polite people, I won't mention either one of them, but I'm sure you know who I mean.
Another great point about the Ba'ath. I mean, the important thing to remember about Iraqi resistance is that historically, since 2003, the vast majority of it has been nationally organized. So there's been very little history of separatism in Iraq, and that goes back many centuries. Other than, of course, the Kurdish question. Within Arab Iraq, Shia and Sunni have worked together historically. So with the invasion, that came under some pressure. So even in 2004, in the first battle of Fallujah and in the second battle of Fallujah, Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shia leader from Najaf, sent supplies to the Sunnis fighting in the Americans in Fallujah. And that was reciprocated. In the summer of 2004, Sunni Anbaris sent supplies, weapons, men to Najaf to help Muqtada al-Sadr fight the Americans there. So the Americans were looking at the nightmare scenario, where they had a unified Shia and Sunni insurgency on their hands. The Mahdi army cooperating with the Anbari sheikhs. That is the worst possible outcome for the invasion. And you see the American body count just escalate massively in 2004. So what they did is they did, what occupiers always do, what the British actually did par excellence. And that is they split one person from the other. They armed the Shia, they gave them the Ministry of Interior, the Badr Brigades, and they took over. And then subsequently, of course, in 2007, they armed the Sunnis and let them fight it out themselves. The so-called Safwa. So anyway, within the national resistance, there was always a strand of separatism. There was always that element saying, well, actually, Iraq is finished. Iraq is falling apart. The invasion has killed Iraq. And that was actually initially led by Shia Ayatollah al-Hakim, the brother who was killed by Zakawi, and then the other brother. And he wrote, pro-Iranian, lived most of their lives in Iran. And they wrote in 2004 that actually the southern states of Iraq, Basra, the oil-rich states, could succeed and be independent somehow, and perhaps join with Iran in their kind of, their leadership of the faqih that they have, the kind of Shia version of the caliphate in some way. And that had a big impact on Sunni thought in Anbar in particular, and that empowered Zakawi and his thugs, and gave them a kind of platform to speak, as more and more Sunnis began to conclude, well, actually Iraq may be finished, and we need to arm ourselves and be ready for that. And that's really where Islamic State came from, this separatist argument.
But within that, there are three key elements of Islamic State. Islamic State is presented to us as monolithic. It's not at all. It contains three very different groups. One is, as you say, the former Ba'ath, and they are in charge of the Islamic State. That accounts for their military prowess. These are highly trained, American trained, of course. America backed Iraq against Iran in the 1980s. These are senior soldiers, good at what they do, good at organizing people, good at building a state, which is what they've done. They are the leadership. And even today, the higher echelons of Islamic State, although almost entirely based in Syria now, is Iraqi. And then the second major group in Islamic State are local tribespeople, local tribal leaders. Famously, Adnan Dalaimi, Ali Hatim, in the early days, the big, leaders of Anbar, who command tens of thousands of forces. And then finally, there's the foreign volunteers. And they're the ones that we hear most about. They're the ones with the long hair, the big beards, beheading people, the Chechens, the Algerians rock up at every fight around the world, traditionally anyway, and they're there in large numbers. Tunisians, Trinidadians, but they're probably comparatively small compared to the other two groups, so we don't really know. I mean, you see plenty of evidence of this. Izzat al-Duri's Nashbandi army. Izzat al-Duri, of course, former deputy president of Iraq, a Sufi. And it calls his military outfit Nashbandi, after the great Sufi cleric, widely followed in Turkey. And they probably led the military taking of Mosul. And the governorship of Mosul, once it was taken in 2014, who was it given to? A former Ba'athi general. So you see lots of evidence of the Ba'ath forces there. Essentially, their use of Islam is, of course, informed by this sociology of their makeup, but it's really about legitimizing their use of violence. It's about terrorizing others, giving them a military advantage, and about projecting a state and sort of general kind of claims to legitimacy. I mean, just one final point within the use of violence, which is kind of what's often focused on in Islamic State. Islamic State, by UN figures, have killed far fewer civilians than Assad in any given period. 1 month, 1 year, any period you want to chop up. It's killed far fewer civilians than Assad. It's probably killed far fewer civilians than the US Air Force. We don't really know those figures. But if you think that over the history of involvement in Iraq, more than 2 million Americans served in Iraq, 2 million, the whole generation killed. It's an enormous figure. And I don't know if you've ever read the epidemiological study in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they interviewed returning American soldiers about their use of violence in Iraq. 30% admitted being involved in the death of a non-combatant. That's 1 in 3 of 2 million, potentially, in admitting that they've been involved in the death of a non-combatant. So if we're going to think about violence in Syria and Iraq, we need to think about, who did what to whom there, and where Zarqawi and Baghdadi come from in terms of their use of violence. Because in reality, they are kind of bit players compared to flying, B-1s or the Russian and Syrian Air Force and so on.
Great. Thank you very much, both. I think you would agree with me that it was a wonderful morning. To speakers and with your great participation. We had a fantastic start for the conference. Now, all we need to do is just to go through the normal routine of the conference with our panelists and continue with the good kind of citizenship of engaging in discussions. And just as a means of concluding and closing this, the first session, obviously I would like to thank our keynote speakers, Professor Neil Macfarlane and Professor Tim Jacoby for their keynote this morning. And I'd like to thank our organization committee, the people who make this conference a reality. And they are academics from different parts of Turkey, Dr. Özgür Tüfekçi and Dr. Tabak and Dr. Rahman Da, and others, a number of others who I'm not able to name right now. They work tirelessly to put together this conference, and it's now become a tradition. Whoever works on Eurasian politics, now they know that they can meet up once a year here in Istanbul, and perhaps, guys may decide to take it somewhere else in Turkey. I don't know, they always come up with interesting ideas. Here we are in a Mekane this year, God knows where we are going to be next year, so just watch that space. But I think the key point really with this conference is the diversity of different voices and opinions. So over the next 2 days, that's what we are hoping, that you'll be able to bring that diversity to discussions. And without diversity, I think there's no science, there's no knowledge, I think we should really break the shackles of that uniformity and homogeneity that has been kind of imposed on us. And I think it's really important that using this as an opportunity to discuss some of these really difficult, challenging issues, but with the purpose of building new knowledge. So I think I will now hand over to Selin because she will need some announcements. We have a family photo session, a conference without family photo. Obviously, that's not possible. So we need to get that done. And then there will be lunch break. Am I right, Selin? Yes? Selin is asking me. All right. That will be a lunch break, and then we'll start at what? 1:30. Am I right? You see, guys, I've done my homework. All right. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference.